Imagine walking into a place with confidence, only to be judged by your appearance. That's exactly what happened to a powerful woman, but no one could have predicted the impact she would make when her true identity was revealed. This story will surprise you, inspire you, and make you reflect on prejudice, justice, and resilience. Stay until the end to discover how an act of discrimination turned into a transformative movement. Are you ready for this twist? There she was, Victoria Bennett, a woman whose presence could command any room, stepping into Leap Motors with an air of quiet confidence. Her tailored suit whispered sophistication, and her gaze carried the weight of years spent building an empire from scratch. Yet, as she walked through the glass doors of this luxury car dealership, she was met not with respect, but with thinly veiled disdain. The owner, Blake Thompson, barely looked up from his desk before issuing a dismissive glance that spoke louder than words. Isn't it strange how some people judge a book by its cover, forgetting that the most powerful stories are often hidden beneath unassuming exteriors? Blake's smirk widened as he leaned back in his chair, assuming he had her figured out within seconds. "Ma'am," he began, his tone dripping with condescension, "you might want to try one of those used car lots down the street. They're more suitable for someone like you." His words hung in the air like a bad joke at a dinner party, awkward, offensive, and entirely unnecessary. But Victoria didn't flinch. She had encountered this kind of prejudice before and knew better than to let it rattle her. Life has a funny way of testing us when we least expect it, doesn't it? It's in these moments that our true character is revealed. As Victoria stood there, her calm demeanor masking a storm brewing beneath the surface, she couldn't help but reflect on how often people underestimate others based on appearances. Blake saw only what his biases allowed him to see: a black woman who didn't fit his narrow vision of wealth and success. Little did he know, he was about to learn one of life's harshest lessons: underestimating someone can be the quickest route to your own downfall. And so, Victoria smiled a small, knowing smile that hinted at the reckoning to come. Victoria's smile didn't waver as Blake's arrogance reached new heights. He gestured dismissively toward the door, as though her very presence was a disruption to his pristine showroom. "I'm sure you'll find something more in your price range elsewhere," he added with a laugh that echoed through the room like nails on a chalkboard. "It's remarkable how some people wear their ignorance like a badge of honor, isn't it?" Victoria, however, stood rooted in place, her confidence unshaken. She wasn't here to prove anything to anyone, she was here to buy a car. But sometimes, life forces you to confront ignorance head-on, not for yourself, but for the countless others who face the same injustice. When she calmly insisted on being served, Blake's demeanor shifted from condescension to hostility. His voice hardened as he called for security, barking orders as though Victoria had committed some unspeakable crime by merely existing in his space. "I'll have to ask you to leave," he sneered, his tone laced with venom. The irony was almost laughable. Here was a man guarding luxury cars as if they were treasures meant only for a select few, oblivious to the fact that true wealth has nothing to do with possessions and everything to do with character. Victoria's silence spoke volumes. She wouldn't stoop to his level. After all, dignity is a language that some people will never understand. As security approached, Blake made one final move that would seal his fate. He called the police. The absurdity of the situation was almost too much to bear. A successful woman being treated like a criminal for daring to step into a luxury dealership. It was the kind of story you'd expect to hear about someone else until it happens to you. But Victoria knew better than to let anger cloud her judgment. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about challenging a system that allowed people like Blake to thrive unchecked. And so, with grace and composure, she prepared herself for what came next. The situation spiraled further as the police arrived, their presence lending an air of gravity to what was, in reality, a petty display of Blake's prejudice. Victoria stood tall, her head held high, as officers approached her with suspicion written all over their faces. Blake wasted no time spinning his narrative, painting her as a disruptive troublemaker. Isn't it astounding how quickly some people weaponize authority to mask their own insecurities? Victoria didn't argue or raise her voice. She knew that sometimes silence is the loudest protest. Her calm demeanor was a quiet rebellion against the chaos Blake had unleashed. The officers acting on Blake's accusations moved to handcuff Victoria without so much as a second thought. The cold steel around her wrists wasn't just a physical restraint, it was a symbol of the systemic bias she had fought against her entire life. Onlookers whispered and stared, some in shock, others in silent agreement with Blake's actions. It's a sobering reminder of how deeply ingrained prejudice can be, isn't it? People often choose to believe the worst about someone who doesn't fit their narrow definition of belonging. But Victoria wasn't just anyone, she was a force of nature, and this moment would become the catalyst for something far greater. As she was escorted out of the dealership, Blake watched with a smug grin plastered across his face. He thought he had won, that he had put Victoria in her place. Little did he know, he had just set the stage for his own undoing. Life has a peculiar way of flipping the script when you least expect it. Sometimes the very thing meant to break you becomes the foundation for your greatest triumph. And as Victoria stepped into the back of the police car, she wasn't defeated. She was already planning her next move. As Victoria sat in the back of the police car, her hands cuffed and her dignity momentarily bruised, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. This wasn't the first time she had been underestimated, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But this time felt different. The injustice wasn't just personal, it was emblematic of a larger, systemic issue that countless others face daily. Isn't it infuriating how often power is abused, not to protect, but to oppress? Yet, Victoria didn't let anger consume her. Instead, she saw this as an opportunity, a chance to shine a light on the darkness of prejudice and ignorance. Blake's smugness was palpable as he stood at the dealership's entrance, watching the scene unfold like a self-satisfied villain in a poorly written drama. He probably thought this was the end of the story, that he had successfully rid his pristine showroom of someone he deemed unworthy. But life doesn't work that way, does it? Karma has a way of creeping up on those who think they're untouchable. Victoria's silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. She knew that every move Blake made was digging him deeper into a hole he wouldn't be able to climb out of. At the station, Victoria remained composed, answering questions with poise while keeping her thoughts focused on what came next. She wasn't just thinking about herself, she was thinking about her son, about the values she had instilled in him, and about how this moment could become a lesson in resilience and justice. Life throws curveballs when you least expect them, but it's how you respond that defines you. And Victoria? She was already planning her counterattack, knowing full well that this story wasn't over, it was just beginning. Victoria Bennett's life was a testament to grit, resilience, and the unyielding power of determination. Born into modest beginnings, she had faced more than her fair share of adversity. After losing her husband unexpectedly, she found herself alone with a young son to raise and a mountain of bills to pay. But instead of succumbing to despair, she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. Isn't it fascinating how life's toughest challenges often reveal our greatest strengths? Victoria didn't just survive, she thrived, building a financial empire brick by brick, while instilling in her son the values of perseverance and integrity. Her journey wasn't without its struggles. As a Black woman in the corporate world, she had to fight twice as hard for half as much recognition. Doors that opened easily for others were slammed in her face, but Victoria had a knack for creating her own opportunities. She founded Bennett Financial Group from her kitchen table, turning it into one of the most respected firms in the industry. Her story was proof that success isn't about where you start, it's about how far you're willing to go. And through it all, she never lost sight of what mattered most, raising her son to be a man of principle and purpose. Victoria's success wasn't just measured in dollars and accolades, it was reflected in the person her son had become. She had taught him that wealth meant nothing without character, and power meant nothing without compassion. Every setback she faced became a lesson for him, every triumph a reminder that anything was possible with hard work and faith. And now, as she sat in that police station, humiliated but not broken, she knew one thing for certain. This moment would become another chapter in their shared story of resilience and justice. Marcus J.R.B. was the embodiment of his mother's values, a man whose brilliance and determination were matched only by his unwavering sense of justice. From a young age, he had watched Victoria navigate life's storms with grace, learning from her that obstacles weren't barriers, they were stepping stones. Fueled by her example, he pursued a career in law, specializing in corporate and civil rights cases. Isn't it inspiring how the seeds of resilience planted by one generation can bloom into greatness in the next? Marcus wasn't just a lawyer. He was a force for change, fighting battles that others were too afraid to confront. His reputation preceded him in courtrooms across the country. Marcus had a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue, dismantling arguments with precision and poise. But what truly set him apart was his empathy. He didn't just see cases, he saw people, their struggles, and their stories. It was this combination of intellect and humanity that made him one of the most sought-after attorneys in his field. Yet, despite his success, Marcus remained grounded. He carried his mother's lessons with him like an invisible compass, guiding him through the complexities of power and privilege. When Marcus heard about what had happened to Victoria at Elite Motors, he didn't react with anger or outrage. He responded with strategy. This wasn't just about defending his mother. It was about holding people accountable for their actions and challenging the systems that allowed such behavior to persist. He knew that justice wasn't something you waited for, it was something you demanded. And as he prepared to confront Blake Thompson, Marcus felt a deep sense of purpose. This wasn't just a legal battle. It was a fight for dignity, equality, and the values his mother had spent her life teaching him. Sitting in the stark, cold room of the police station, Victoria's mind was anything but still. While others might have crumbled under the weight of humiliation, she sat composed, her thoughts weaving a plan as sharp and intricate as the life she had built. This wasn't her first encounter with adversity, and it likely wouldn't be her last. Isn't it remarkable how life's toughest moments often serve as mirrors, reflecting what we're truly made of? Victoria wasn't just thinking about herself, she was thinking about the countless others who had been silenced by prejudice, those who didn't have the resources or voice to fight back. The officers questioned her, their tone laced with the same skepticism she had faced earlier. But Victoria answered calmly, her words deliberate and measured. She wasn't here to argue or plead. She was here to observe, to take mental notes that would later become the foundation of her response. Sometimes silence is more powerful than words. It forces people to confront their own biases without the distraction of anger or emotion. Victoria's silence wasn't weakness. It was strategy. She knew that every second she spent in that room was building toward something far greater than Blake Thompson's petty arrogance. As the hours ticked by, Victoria allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She thought about Marcus J.R.B., about how proud he would be of her composure and resolve. She thought about the values she had instilled in him: justice, integrity, and strength in the face of adversity. And most importantly, she thought about how this moment could be transformed into something meaningful. Life has a way of turning trials into opportunities if you let it. And Victoria? She was already envisioning the steps ahead, knowing full well that this wasn't an ending, it was merely a pause before the storm. A week later, the quiet resolve Victoria had shown at the police station gave way to calculated action. Marcus J.R.B. strode into Elite Motors with a confidence that turned heads, his tailored suit and commanding presence a stark contrast to Blake's smug arrogance. In his hand were legal documents, thick, official, and damning. Isn't it satisfying when justice begins to take shape? Marcus wasn't here for theatrics. He was here to deliver a message. Actions have consequences. Blake barely had time to process what was happening before Marcus laid out the accusations: discrimination, false imprisonment, and reputational harm. The weight of the law now bore down on the man who had so carelessly wielded his prejudice. Blake's face turned pale as Marcus spoke with precision and authority, outlining the legal ramifications of his actions. The dealership owner, who had once laughed at Victoria's presence, now found himself on the defensive, scrambling for words that wouldn't come. It's funny how quickly arrogance can crumble when faced with accountability, isn't it? Marcus wasn't just representing his mother, he was representing every person who had ever been dismissed or demeaned because of someone else's ignorance. His words weren't just legal jargon. They were a declaration that this kind of behavior would no longer go unchecked. As Marcus finished presenting the case, he delivered the final blow. Victoria Bennett wasn't just a wronged customer, she was the CEO of Bennett Financial Group. And not only that, but her company had recently acquired a controlling stake in Elite Motors' parent company. The revelation hit Blake like a freight train. The very woman he had mocked now held the power to decide his professional fate. Life has a way of humbling those who think they're untouchable, doesn't it? And as Marcus walked out of the dealership, leaving Blake to grapple with the fallout, it was clear that this battle was far from over. It was only just beginning. Blake sat frozen in his office chair, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in like a stone dropped into still water. The room, once his kingdom, now felt like a trap closing in on him. How could he have been so blind? The woman he had ridiculed, dismissed, and humiliated wasn't just another customer. She was the powerhouse behind Bennett Financial Group, the very company that now controlled his dealership's future. Isn't it ironic how life has a way of flipping the script when you least expect it? Blake's arrogance had blinded him to the truth, and now he was left to face the consequences of his actions. As Marcus revealed the details of the controlling stake Victoria's company held, Blake's face turned an ashen shade of white. The confidence he once wore like armor was stripped away, leaving only panic and regret. "This can't be happening," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. But it was happening. Marcus didn't gloat or raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calm, measured tone carried more weight than any outburst ever could. Isn't it fascinating how true power is often quiet? Marcus wasn't there to humiliate Blake. He was there to teach him a lesson that would resonate long after this moment had passed. Blake's mind raced as Marcus outlined what came next: lawsuits for discrimination and false imprisonment, formal complaints to regulatory boards, and a complete overhaul of Elite Motors policies under Bennett Financial Group's watchful eye. The man who had once laughed at Victoria now sat trembling before her son, realizing too late that his prejudice had cost him everything. Life doesn't often give second chances to those who squander their first, does it? And as Marcus walked out of the office, leaving Blake to stew in his regret, one thing was clear: the days of unchecked arrogance at Elite Motors were over. The fallout was swift and merciless. Under the leadership of Bennett Financial Group, Elite Motors was thrust into a whirlwind of scrutiny and reform. Blake's actions had not only tarnished the dealership's reputation, but also exposed the toxic culture festering beneath its polished exterior. Isn't it remarkable how one person's arrogance can unravel an entire system? Marcus ensured that every discriminatory practice, every unchecked bias was brought to light. The lawsuits were just the beginning. Regulatory complaints and public backlash followed, leaving no corner of Elite Motors untouched by accountability. Blake, once the untouchable king of his domain, found himself stripped of his position. The board of directors, under pressure from Bennett Financial Group, had no choice but to remove him from power. It was a poetic twist of fate. The man who had wielded authority so carelessly now found himself at the mercy of forces far greater than him. Life has a way of teaching us that power without integrity is a house built on sand. It crumbles at the first sign of a storm. And Blake's empire, it was reduced to rubble, a cautionary tale for anyone who dared to walk the same path. Meanwhile, Victoria and Marcus didn't stop at dismantling Blake's career. They turned their attention to rebuilding Elite Motors from the ground up. Diversity training programs were implemented, hiring policies were overhauled, and a zero-tolerance stance on discrimination became company doctrine. Isn't it inspiring how moments of injustice can spark lasting change? The dealership that had once been a symbol of exclusivity and prejudice was now on its way to becoming a model for inclusivity and fairness. And though the road ahead was long, Victoria and Marcus knew one thing for certain. They had turned pain into purpose, proving that even in darkness, there is always room for light. With Bennett Financial Group at the helm, Elite Motors underwent a transformation that was as thorough as it was necessary. Every corner of the company was scrutinized, every policy dissected, and every practice reimagined. Marcus spearheaded the reforms with the same precision he brought to courtrooms, ensuring that no stone was left unturned. Isn't it fascinating how adversity can lead to progress when the right people take charge? The dealership, once a breeding ground for prejudice, now became a testing ground for what corporate accountability could look like in action. Diversity training sessions were rolled out across all branches, mandatory for every employee from the showroom floor to the executive suite. These weren't just token efforts to save face, they were deep dives into understanding bias, privilege, and the importance of equity. Hiring practices were revamped to prioritize inclusivity, ensuring that people from all walks of life had a fair shot at success within the company. It's striking how change often begins with uncomfortable conversations, isn't it? But discomfort is where growth happens, and Elite Motors was finally beginning to grow in the right direction. The reforms didn't stop there. A zero-tolerance policy for discrimination was enforced with strict consequences for violations. Employees were encouraged to report misconduct without fear of retaliation, creating an environment where accountability wasn't just expected, it was celebrated. Victoria and Marcus knew that systemic change required more than surface-level fixes. It required a cultural shift. And while the journey was far from over, they had planted seeds of transformation that would continue to grow long after Blake's downfall. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't about defeating an opponent, they're about building something better in their place. Blake Thompson's world unraveled faster than he could have ever imagined. Stripped of his position at Elite Motors, he became a pariah in the luxury car industry, a man whose name was now synonymous with arrogance and prejudice. The lawsuits against him piled up like a dam about to burst, each one chipping away at the life of privilege he had once taken for granted. Isn't it ironic how those who wield power carelessly are often the least prepared to face its consequences? Blake's downfall wasn't just professional. It was personal. His reputation, his career, and the empire he had built were all reduced to ashes. The media caught wind of the story, amplifying Blake's disgrace for the world to see. Headlines painted him as the face of systemic discrimination in luxury spaces, and his actions became a cautionary tale for businesses everywhere. His peers distanced themselves, his allies disappeared, and even those who had once admired him turned their backs. Life has a way of isolating those who refuse to learn its lessons, doesn't it? Blake had spent years looking down on others, but now he found himself at rock bottom, forced to confront the very biases that had led to his undoing. Meanwhile, Victoria and Marcus didn't waste time dwelling on Blake's fate. They knew that his downfall was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. Their focus remained on creating lasting change, not just within Elite Motors, but across industries where prejudice still thrived unchecked. Blake's story served as a reminder that no one is untouchable when justice is on the line. And as he faded into obscurity, Victoria and Marcus continued their work, proving that true power lies not in tearing others down, but in lifting others up. The story of what happened at Elite Motors spread like wildfire, capturing the attention of news outlets, social media platforms, and advocacy groups across the country. Victoria's unjust treatment and Marcus's swift legal counterattack became a rallying cry for those who had long endured similar indignities in silence. Isn't it remarkable how one act of courage can ripple outward, touching lives far beyond its original scope? The incident sparked a national conversation about racial profiling in luxury spaces and the broader issue of systemic discrimination. People began sharing their own stories, and what started as one family's fight for justice grew into a movement. Corporate America took notice. Companies in industries far removed from luxury car dealerships began reevaluating their policies, fearing they might be the next to face public scrutiny. Diversity and inclusion initiatives that had once been treated as afterthoughts were suddenly thrust into the spotlight. It's interesting how accountability can inspire change when people realize their reputations and profits are on the line, isn't it? Victoria and Marcus didn't just expose one man's prejudice. They forced an entire sector to confront its shortcomings. Their story became a blueprint for how to demand justice in spaces where it had long been denied. The media frenzy wasn't just about outrage, it was about hope. Victoria and Marcus became symbols of resilience and empowerment, showing that it was possible to turn even the most humiliating experiences into catalysts for change. Interviews with Victoria highlighted her grace under pressure, while Marcus's sharp legal mind made him a hero to aspiring lawyers everywhere. Together, they proved that no matter how deeply rooted injustice may seem, it can be uprooted with determination and courage. And as their story continued to inspire others, it became clear that this wasn't just a moment, it was the beginning of a movement. Victoria and Marcus knew that their fight couldn't end with Elite Motors. The injustice they had faced was just one example of a much larger problem, one that countless others encountered daily without the resources or platform to fight back. So they took their experience and turned it into something transformative, the creation of a foundation dedicated to combating racial discrimination in consumer spaces. Isn't it inspiring how pain can be repurposed into purpose? The foundation became a beacon of hope, offering legal aid, advocacy, and education to those who had been silenced by prejudice. The foundation's mission was clear: to ensure that no one else would have to endure the humiliation and injustice Victoria had faced. They partnered with civil rights organizations, corporate leaders, and policymakers to push for systemic change. Workshops were held to educate businesses on unconscious bias, while grants were provided to support victims of discrimination in pursuing justice. It's incredible how one family's determination can spark a movement that benefits so many others, isn't it? Victoria and Marcus weren't just fighting for themselves, they were fighting for a world where dignity and respect weren't privileges but rights. The foundation quickly gained traction, garnering widespread support from individuals and organizations alike. Media outlets highlighted its work, and donations poured in from people who believed in its mission. Victoria's story became a rallying cry for change, while Marcus's legal expertise gave the foundation the credibility it needed to challenge even the most powerful institutions. Together, they turned their personal ordeal into a platform for empowerment. And as they watched the foundation grow, they knew that their legacy wouldn't just be about overcoming injustice, it would be about ensuring that others could do the same. Victoria Bennett's return to Elite Motors wasn't one of anger or vengeance. It was a quiet, triumphant moment that spoke louder than any words could. A few months after the dust had settled, she drove past the dealership in not one, but two brand-new Aston Martins she had purchased from a competing luxury dealer. The cars gleamed under the sun, a testament to her resilience and success. Isn't it poetic how life often gives us the chance to rewrite the endings to our stories? Victoria didn't need to confront Blake or anyone else at Elite Motors. Her mere presence was enough to remind them of the lesson they'd been forced to learn. As she passed the dealership, employees peeked out of the windows, murmuring among themselves. The once imposing Blake Thompson was nowhere to be seen. His downfall had been swift and irreversible. Victoria didn't gloat or revel in his misfortune. She knew that true victory wasn't about someone else's defeat. It was about rising above the pettiness and proving that dignity always prevails. Life has a way of rewarding those who stay true to their values, doesn't it? And Victoria's triumph wasn't just personal, it was symbolic of a larger fight against prejudice and injustice. Driving away, Victoria felt a deep sense of fulfillment, not because she had won, but because she had turned an ugly experience into something meaningful. The foundation she and Marcus had built was thriving, helping countless others find their voices and seek justice. The two Aston Martins weren't just cars, they were symbols of perseverance, proof that no amount of ignorance or prejudice could diminish her worth. And as she disappeared down the road, leaving Elite Motors behind her, one thing was clear. This wasn't just the end of a chapter, it was the beginning of a legacy. Victoria's story is more than a tale of triumph over prejudice. It's a powerful reminder of the strength that lies in resilience, strategy, and unwavering self-worth. How often do we let others' perceptions define us? How often do we shrink ourselves to fit into spaces that were never designed to welcome us? Victoria didn't just push back against the walls built to exclude her. She tore them down and built something better in their place. Her journey teaches us that life's greatest challenges are often opportunities in disguise, waiting for us to rise to the occasion. Think about the times you've been underestimated or dismissed. Did you let those moments define you, or did you use them as fuel to prove your worth not to others, but to yourself? Victoria and Marcus remind us that justice isn't always handed to us. Sometimes we have to demand it, fight for it, and create it ourselves. Their story shows that even when the odds seem stacked against us, we have the power to rewrite the narrative. Isn't it time we all started seeing obstacles as stepping stones rather than barriers? So, what will you do the next time life challenges you? Will you let it break you, or will you rise above it like Victoria did? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if this story inspired you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you can continue learning about stories of resilience, justice, and empowerment. Together, we can turn life's trials into triumphs.